Thank you everybody for joining today. Like I was saying earlier, we had almost 100 people register, which is outstanding. For those that don't know me, my name is Tim Lampkin with Bolton and Mink. I am the section president this year. So I'm going to kick the meeting off before I turn it over to Nick and Katie. But thanks again. This is December section meeting for ASCE, so hope you're in the right spot. The way we're going to run this is once we get started, we're going to mute everybody. Lauren will watch the chat in case you've got any technical issues. Please shoot a note there, and she'll keep an eye on that. You can throw questions out there too in the chat, or raise your hand as we get closer to the end. But I think we'll go through the presentation first, and then open up for questions. After that, we'll also be sending a follow-up email with PDH certificates. So I think I'll turn it over to Nick to introduce Katie and the rest of the meeting.
Yeah, awesome. So we just go through a few quick transportation committee specific announcements. So the transportation committee is excited to be getting back into the monthly meeting swing of things here. So kind of moving forward, the transportation committee is going to use the second Tuesday of each month for our basic meetings. So as we have done today, we hope to line up speakers for as many of these meetings as possible, but we'll utilize the non-speaker months just for the basic committee meetings and just get together to discuss and assign responsibilities for the upcoming presentations and any other section needs that there might be. If you have an interest in serving on the transportation committee, feel free to reach out and let me know. We can get you onto the invite list. And if you just prefer to continue receiving our speaker event invites only, then don't worry about doing anything at this time. Another announcement, the ASCE Report Card Committee just wants to remind everyone that the 2022 Report Card Committee has started getting together and doing research for the 2022 Minnesota Report Card. In 2018, this team produced grades for 9 of the 22 categories, and we hope that we can represent all 22 categories for our 2022 release. So these report cards were heavily used over at the state capitol to represent the state of the infrastructure here in Minnesota. And many of the professionals who helped work on these had the chance to speak with their legislatures on the topics that they wrote. Specific for today's presentation, the transit and roads categories are both looking to grow their support team and would even be open to someone taking on a lead role if there was anybody who had that desire. So again, you can feel free to reach out to me or the ASCE MN report card email address that you can find on the ASCE website if you have an interest in assisting with that. Again, my name is Nick Turner. I am a professional engineer with Alliant Engineering, the Transportation Committee Chair. So today's section meeting is hosted by the Transportation Committee. And today's speaker is Katie Roth. So I first met Katie 3 or 4 years ago just through a coordination effort of including a bus rapid transit platform on one of the roadway reconstruction projects that I was helping to lead. And it was clear right off the bat that Katie has a passion for the role that bus rapid transit serves within the Twin Cities community. I have gotten to witness Katie's expertise in both the planning and engineering responsibilities of several different projects. And when I reached out to her, I was ecstatic when she agreed to present today for our organization. So I will turn this over now to Katie Roth to discuss the bus rapid transit here in the Twin Cities.
Thank you so much, Nick. I really appreciate the very kind introduction. Excuse me. It's also been great as we're sitting here waiting for folks to come in to see all of the names pop up in the participants list here. It's wonderful to see both partners in the public sector that we've worked with on projects in the past, as well as so many of the great, super talented consultant designers that I see up and down this list. So great to see you all. And those I don't know, it's really nice to meet you remotely. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. let me hear, just bear with me for just a second. I know we're all used to this sort of lag while we all figure out our different systems. So thank you.
Katie, I'm going to jump in. I do believe we did not announce earlier. The session is being recorded. So just a heads up for everybody that we are recording this and will have it available to share afterwards. Sorry for cutting you off there.
Not a problem. All right. So Nick, could you confirm that you can see my slides now?
Yes, your PowerPoint is up.
Excellent, thank you. Well, let's jump in then. Good afternoon, everybody. As Nick mentioned, I'm the Assistant Director of BRT Projects at Metro Transit. And in that role, what my team is responsible for is the planning, engineering, and implementation of a growing network of what we call the arterial BRT lines within the Twin Cities regional transit system. So as we look to what our transit system looks like, I think many folks are probably familiar with the blue line and the green line, the light rail projects, perhaps the planned extensions of those running out to the Southwest and Northwest Metro. We also have highway BRT projects, both existing as well as some in plans, including the orange line on 35W South heading out of downtown Minneapolis down to Burnsville. We've got plans for dedicated guideway bus rapid transit, wherein an entire new roadway would be designed and built for buses to run on primarily on the Gold Line, as well as on the planned Rush Line heading up to White Bear Lake. But then as we look at this arterial BRT program, which is really going to be the focus of my presentation today, these are more about the routes that are that connective tissue between that broader set of regional transit lines. And so these are really corridors that focus on our highest ridership bus routes, ways that we can make them faster, more comfortable for customers, and ultimately grow ridership in some of the areas with both the highest potential to grow ridership in the region and the greatest need. So in terms of that system, just a snapshot of what I'm going to be sharing today. We have two lines in operation, the Metro A line and the C line that opened in 2016 and 2019. I see some of our designers from Kimley Horn on the line who aided in delivering that A line, as well as folks from HDR and Stonebrook on the C line. And as we look ahead, we've got three lines in active development right now, and these are the D line, B line, and E line. These are all planned to open between 2022 and 2024. And so the work we're doing right now also extends into looking at what are the additional lines that we can start getting into that project pipeline to build out this network. And we've identified 10 potential lines for consideration between 2025 and 2040. And I'll speak to the Network Next planning process by which we are seeking to actively identify those next priorities right now. So for those who may be less familiar with arterial BRT, this is typically the point in a presentation where I'd ask the folks in the room to raise their hands and say who's ridden the A line or C line. We're not able to do that in this case, so I'll kind of introduce this a little bit and hope that there are folks who are familiar with this on the line. But generally, our goals are to, as I mentioned, improve our highest ridership bus routes, primarily with a few things. And one is a faster and more reliable ride. So both in terms of decreasing the time it takes to get places relative to an existing local bus route. We try to be 20 to 25% faster than our existing core bus routes. The picture shown here is the Route 21. There are 3 buses stacked up. That shouldn't happen. And so a lot of the tools that we're trying to implement with these BRT lines seek to improve that speed, improve the reliability, and make the route faster. We're also seeking to expand that access for frequent, all-day, everyday access to a network of destinations. That means serving all kinds of trip types, serving 9-to-5 commutes, but also serving off-peak commutes, serving the kinds of trips people take to get to the grocery store, to the doctor, to see friends, to really live their lives around. So when we think about these lines, they are not commuter routes. They are about serving all kinds of trips. And that's really where we see the future of transit demand going. And then we're thinking about how can we improve the experience and make it more dignified, both on board the bus as well as at the station. And I believe this picture is from the inside of either a Route 5 or a Route 21 bus, where it's kind of standard to see, especially before COVID, just a packed bus. And then sometimes a bus stop experience that might just be a pole in the ground, thinking about how can we really make that an experience that people want to be in from the start to the finish. So what are the tools that we use to address those goals and to try to address the challenges and meet the goals of these lines? First and foremost, we start by stopping the bus less often. If you've ridden a lot of local buses, either in this region or others, it's fairly typical to have a bus that stops about every 600 to 800 feet. Versus on this system, what we're trying to do is site stations about every half mile, so that while folks are walking or rolling a little bit more to get to the bus stop, once they get there, they're going to be in motion more and stopping less. At those stops, we decrease the amount of time the bus is stopped for by moving all of that fare collection off board. So instead of lining up at the front door to pay with cash or sometimes with nickels and paper clips, people are paying their fare on the platform with either cash or a credit card, and then have already paid when the bus pulls up and can enter through any door, just like on a light rail vehicle. Our buses also have higher capacity and more interior circulation, so that it's less likely that you're going to be bottlenecked and trying to get in or out of that vehicle, navigating through throngs of other people. The stations themselves, because we're asking people to walk a little bit further to get to a station, we want to make sure that there is a destination, a there that really signals this is where you get the bus. This is the kind of experience we are providing for you. So that means high tech, high amenity, and secure stations that have both security cameras, emergency telephones, real-time information telling you when the next bus is going to arrive, push button heat, and then a well-lit platform. As I mentioned, we really want to be thinking about that frequent all-day service. And as we build out a network of these types of lines, providing a lot of opportunities for people to make connections across different lines with high frequency is really important. And so increasingly, as we're thinking about building out this network, we're trying to maximize that reach of maybe not just along the line, but along that entire network of frequent and all-day service. And then more and more, as we think about the deployment of these lines, we're trying to focus on, yes, all of these factors, all of the things that are on the kind of metro transit side of being able to make the trip faster, but also really thinking about the partnerships with our cities and our counties who own the streets, to think about where we can prioritize buses, both through things that have been part of our standard kit of improvements, including some transit signal priority, but also thinking more about where can we be strategic in prioritizing some lane space for buses. Examples of this, like on the Hennepin Avenue bus lanes that were rolled out in 2019, thinking about red lanes and other things we can do to keep buses moving and reduce delays from traffic. So as we think about all of those, we've arrived at more of a standard kit for how our stations look. On the left is a real photo of the Penn and 43rd station on the C line. On the right is a rendering of the Chicago and Franklin station on the D line that's just about to enter construction. And what you'll notice is that we're planning for these to look very similar. We're not planning to reinvent the wheel when it comes to that station design, and that's really intentional, both to maximize our efficiency in being able to deliver these projects, but also as we think about maintaining a growing system of stations, we want to really have both an identity that our customers can expect and recognize from line to line, but also something where our maintenance folks can easily maintain this growing set of stations across what will be several hundred of these stations if our plans all go according to plan. So certainly as we're thinking about expanding this system, I want to just highlight that this is a really core piece, but that there are challenges that we face in each of these corridors and lots of things that we're trying to do to tailor each of these more standardized designs to fit each context. So as I mentioned, we've got a few lines that I want to go through in a little bit more detail today. The two that are in operations, and then just a snapshot of where we're at on each of these projects in development. The D line on Chicago and Fremont is in pre-construction right now, I guess is the phase. We are at 1 o'clock going into a pre-bid meeting on this project and planning to start construction in the spring. So this is really just around the corner. We'll plan for 2 years of construction and then open this line for customers in late 2022. Just behind that is the B line on Lake Street and Marshall Avenue, which is in planning right now and planned to open in 2024. And the E line as well. This is also in planning right now, planned to open in 2024. And as I mentioned, we're in the process of identifying the next lines, the F, G, and H lines just to come after this. We will be naming those in the spring of 2021. And so a lot going on, and I'll get into more of these in the slides to come. So starting off here in terms of what have we seen with the A line and the C line since we opened them. This is a chart showing the ridership growth on both of these corridors. And I think the key story here is that prior to a lot of things changing in the early part of 2020 due to the pandemic, we were seeing high and sustained growth on both the A line and the C line corridors, pretty much effective from when we implemented them, which you can see on the top chart was in 2016, and in 2019 for the C line on the bottom. The immediate growth was near 30% higher than the previous bus route ridership in both of these cases, and also, as I mentioned, was growing. Certainly, it's no surprise that as travel patterns changed, as folks were staying home from work, and as we at Metro Transit were actively asking people not to ride transit so that folks who really needed to make essential trips had space on buses, a lot of things have changed this year. But I think one thing I do want to highlight is that the role of these routes, both in terms of existing BRT lines, as well as those that we're planning to make into BRT lines, that has grown even as we've looked at the changes in travel patterns during COVID. So this chart here just snapshots with the darkest blue on the left, pre-COVID in 2019, of our daily bus ridership at Metro Transit. 7% of that was carried in 2019 on the A line and the C line, which is pretty great. If you think about 7% of the bus ridership just on 2 lines, they're definitely punching above their weight there. As we think about the existing routes that we plan to upgrade into the D line, the B line, and the E line, that grows that total to 22% of all of our rides on those routes. And then as I get later in this presentation into the 10 corridors we are planning in Network Next for implementation between now and 2040, if we built out that entire system, 50% of all Metro Transit bus rides pre-COVID were on those routes where we either have BRT, are working on it right now, or planning for it for the future. And then, as I mentioned, as we shift into looking at during 2020, the average weekday during the pandemic, the A line and the C line moved from carrying 7% of our bus ridership to 10%. And as we think about those next 3 lines in the pipeline, it grows to nearly 30% of our bus riders being on those routes, and nearly 2/3 as we think about the system that we want to build between now and 2040. So I share this to underscore that while a lot is changing about how people get around during COVID, and there's a lot I think that we will continue to learn about the changes that may stick with us in terms of people working from home or making trips differently, what we do see is that the fast, frequent, all-day service on our core routes continues to be something that is really at the heart of carrying people in our transit system. And so as we look to the future, we're certainly focusing on BRT as a big part of how we return from the pandemic and think about what's next. So I'm going to pause for just one sip of water before we jump into a little bit more detail about the projects that are in development right now. So as I mentioned, the D line is just around the corner. As we were getting on this call today, Nick was asking about how we fared during this past year as the legislature considered a bonding bill several times across the course of 2020. I think ultimately the great news was that the legislature passed the bonding bill, as folks are certainly aware, and with that fully funded the D line for construction to start next year. So we are pretty elated about that and very excited to get underway so that we can make this really significant improvement. The D line is focused on upgrading our highest ridership bus route, both in the Metro Transit system, but I think, perhaps more significantly in the state of Minnesota. We also see that where this route is planned to travel, there are a number of folks who really depend on transit. A lot of folks who don't have cars in their homes, many people of color and many people with low incomes who are sometimes disinvested in the course of our transportation system. Just with the D line alone, this line would provide one bus access to over 200,000 jobs in the region. And as I mentioned, connect about 1 in 4 households that does not have a vehicle. So really excited to move this forward. Our overall budget for the project shown here is about $75 million, and that includes the vehicles, but also the construction, all of our systems, the fare collection, everything of that nature, and the costs to deliver this project. So as we look into what construction will look like across the next couple of years, we'll see stations like the one on the left here start to go into the ground, a lot of sidewalk work, a lot of street reconstruction kind of targeted in the area around these stations up and down Chicago Avenue in South Minneapolis, Emerson Fremont Avenue on the north side, all the way down to the Mall of America in Bloomington. And then as we get closer to opening the line, we'll start to see shelters come out of the ground, similar to what we see here. Again, using that kit of parts approach and really building on what we've already delivered in our BRT system, but growing it in this line. So as we turn the page then to the next project in development, this is the Metro B line. And this is an upgrade to Route 21, which runs east-west between uptown Minneapolis and downtown St. Paul. This line, as we'll build it, will run all the way between the Westlake Station on the Metro Green Line extension that's under construction right now. It'll make intersections with other planned BRT projects on 35W, the E line and the D line, connect with the Lake Street Midtown Station with the Metro Blue line, and then move over to downtown St. Paul. So again, as we look at who will benefit from the implementation of this line, we're really focused on the equity impacts of this investment and see that, again, in this corridor, there are many, many folks who depend on transit, a lot of high ridership today, and a lot of populations that we as Met Council want to invest in when we think about those equity implications of our transportation investments. So as we think also about, as Nick mentioned in his introduction, Metro Transit has a history of delivering these projects in cooperation with other street reconstructions, with other public works activities happening in each of the areas that our very long projects span. And so just to snapshot how we're doing that on the B line, you may have noticed a lot of construction around 35W Lake area with the very exciting Metro Orange Line station coming out of the ground there. That's going to span 2 levels. And on the Lake Street level of that, we'll have coordinated delivery of a station for the B line that'll make some really great connections to that Metro Orange Line up above. I mentioned also connecting on the west side to the Metro Green Line extension. We're going to be also working with Hennepin County, MnDOT, and the city of Minneapolis as Hiawatha and Lake improvements move forward near the Lake Street Midtown Station. And then also coordinating with other transit projects along with the city of St. Paul and Ramsey County as we think about implementing stations in downtown St. Paul for the Metro Gold Line that'll be shared by the B line. So again, really stringing together a lot of coordination across the metro area to deliver this project aligned with many others that we're working with as well. So some of the specific challenges on the B line beyond as we think about kind of continuing to build out that kit of parts and fitting each of those stations into the specific contexts. One of the things that really stands out about the B line and about Route 21 today is that it is one of our slowest routes. The bar chart here on the left shows 2 things. The bars showing the total travel time that it takes to get from one end to the other, and the line showing the speed of our buses across different times of day shown at the bottom of the chart. So you can see that during the OWL, which is the late night service, that's maybe kind of the free flow condition wherein buses can travel fairly quickly across the corridor, but that really changes throughout the day, especially during the PM peak period. Buses are really hung up by a lot of traffic, a lot of congestion along this corridor, as well as factors on the Metro Transit on the customer side of many, many people waiting to board buses stopping every block. And when they do, it takes quite a while to get people on and off that bus. So all of those improvements that I talked about are really critical to making speed and reliability improvements in this corridor. And we're also thinking about that kind of aligned with where is transit carrying the most people in the corridor. And in particular, so if we look at the graphic on the right, at Lake Street and 12th Avenue, for example, we see that buses are making up less than 2% of the vehicles in the corridor, but are carrying 21% of the corridor users. And I think this is during the PM peak. So we know that transit is, again, punching above its weight when it comes to the use of road space and the ability to move people through that corridor. So really thinking about how can we try to meet the goals of making service 20 to 25% faster, and really think hard about how that fits into the overall transportation system here. If we're able to do that, I think what we see is that the ability of a project like the Beeline to really grow accessibility and deliver increased access to jobs and opportunity is really significant. So as we toggle between looking at kind of the existing condition today with Route 21 and the concentric circles showing how far somebody could get from where we see Jane on the map here in St. Paul in these various amounts of time, that grows really significantly when we think about adding the Beeline with being able to make that 20 to 25% faster. We can also see parts of the network start to emerge. So the A line and the ability to get further along that network, capitalizing on the improvements of the orange line, as I mentioned. So this is what we're thinking about, is how can we get people where they need to be, where the access to opportunity and jobs is in a faster way. And again, as I mentioned, just showing kind of a different view of it, these two charts show us where we can think about really targeting those improvements to have the most effect where the greatest amount of delay is experienced today, which on this map, you can see the reds and the oranges that show the most amount of delay really focused between Hiawatha Avenue and 35W. And I think this probably doesn't surprise anybody who travels in the Lake Street corridor. But just sharing this to kind of give you a snapshot of some of the challenges that we're thinking about as we approach this next arterial BRT line and really try to think about how we can continue to broaden the set of tools in our toolbox to focus on reducing reliability challenges and increasing the speed of buses, ultimately making buses a much more attractive way for people to get around in this corridor. So in terms of our next steps, we are hard at work putting together a corridor plan for the Beeline right now. And a snapshot of that is just shown on the right here. This is really a concept level look at where stations would be and on which corners those two station platforms at each location would be located at. This is something that we'll release in a draft form for public comment in the early part of 2021, go through a couple of iterations of plan review and modification with more public engagement, and ultimately bring a plan to the Met Council for approval in the middle of next year. Once we do that, we have our station locations locked in, which allows us to move into that engineering phase. And so we're going to be releasing an RFP very quickly here for engineering and construction administration services on this project, so that as we move through procurement, we're in a position to start the preliminary design of that corridor right around the time the Met Council approves the final plan for stations. We plan to move through that in 2021, move into final design across the year of 2022, and ultimately advertise for construction about 2 years from right now, so that we can start construction on the Beeline in 2023, wrap it up in 2024, and open for service in 2024. So a lot of good stuff coming up on the Beeline. Very excited to move this project forward. As we look to then the next project in the queue, this is the Metro E line along Hennepin and France Avenues primarily. This is just behind the Beeline in terms of its schedule. We are also planning to open this for service in 2024, also planning for 2023 and 2024 construction. But the difference being that the Metro E line is not a fully funded project yet. And so as the legislature acted to not only fund the D line and the B line in last legislative session's bonding bill, the E-line was not part of that, but we're hopeful to continue to pull together funding so that we can implement this project on this timeline. Again, here, one of the challenges will be continuing to think about how we can maximize speed and reliability for buses, building on some of the improvements that already exist in the corridor. So I mentioned the Hennepin bus lanes. This is something that really Minneapolis was the leader, and we partnered with them to implement this in 2019. It's been really successful in terms of decreasing the variability of how long it takes a bus to get through that corridor. But we know that there are other key challenges in this area, primarily the Hennepin and Lyndale Commons area, going through downtown Minneapolis, as well as getting over toward the university on 4th Street and University Avenues. So lots of challenges to dig into on this project as well, and things that we are continuing to work through with our partners as we're thinking about how the E-line fits into this corridor. The other story of the E-line, similar to a lot of these other projects, is that we are working closely with a lot of other entities and other projects that are underway to really maximize how efficiently we can deliver these projects and really fit the roadway improvements and the transit improvements together. And so there are 3 projects along Hennepin Avenue that we've been deeply in coordination with the city of Minneapolis on. Notably, the downtown at Hennepin Avenue reconstruction that's ongoing right now. You'll see if you travel near there or see pictures of that there are BRT ready stations that have already started to come out of the ground there. In Uptown, two street segments here from Lake to 36 that was recently reconstructed and done so in a way that really sets the stage for easier implementation of our stations in that segment. And then from Douglas to Lake, we're working closely with the city as they plan for a 2023 reconstruction of that street. We're also working, with Hennepin County and the city as a couple of bikeway projects are moving forward along both First and Hennepin and 4th and University. So lots of sort of a string of pearls that we're tying together as we think about these projects coming together. So then in terms of looking to the future, I do want to spend just a couple of minutes sharing about Network Next, wherein we will be naming the F, G, and H lines and really thinking of what's next as well. So in terms of timeline, Network Next is a 2040 plan that establishes the vision for the 2040 transit network within Metro Transit's service area. But within that, we're also focusing on priorities for implementation within that really 15-year time horizon. So as I mentioned, we've got 3 lines in development, but then our task ahead of us right now is to identify the F, G, and H lines that we'd be targeting for implementation between 2025 and 2030, so that we can start getting those into the pipeline, begin the planning and engineering so that we're able to deliver those projects. As we're going through this entire plan, we're really focusing on how we can align our priorities with 4 principles that are based in Met Council policy and also really shaped by a lot of performance data, as well as a pretty robust community engagement and input approach. You can see these here. We're focused on equity, on ridership, on supporting a transit-oriented lifestyle, and on costs so that we can deliver a long-term sustainable system into the future. So in terms of where we're at right now in this process, we've just gone through a pretty detailed evaluation step to take what was once a broader set of corridors that we narrowed down. We're further narrowing that down. And just last week, released some recommendations for 3 tiers of corridors for near-term, midterm, and longer-term tiers. And from there, we'll be working over the next few months to prioritize the F, G, and H lines from that top tier of corridors. So just a little bit about this. We initially started with looking at a very broad set of 19 initial corridors on the basis of those 4 principles that I mentioned, but also looking at high ridership routes, high frequency routes today, other corridors that we've studied, as well as thinking about balance across the region and across the network. We screened that down to 10 corridors for additional evaluation, and working with our partners at SRF and the HDR team that they've put together, developed some concepts for BRT in each of these corridors so that we could better evaluate the costs, the benefits, and compare each of the corridors to one another for implementation. As part of our work on this, we've done quite a bit of analysis then of each of those corridors and lined up how they would do on these various criteria shown here to make up a total technical score for ultimately trying to prioritize these lines. And this is the result of that. We've just recently, as I mentioned, rolled this out. But with the 10 corridors that we've looked through, the technical scores shown across the top here, arranged from highest on the left to lowest on the right, are a big piece of how we are planning to prioritize these lines. But certainly as we think ahead, it's not the only factor in terms of how each of these does by the numbers, but also thinking about, is any of these corridors not ready to be implemented in the near term because of other things that are underway in the corridor? Primarily asking the question of, are there other transit studies, other transit efforts that are affecting whether we'd be ready to implement and build BRT starting in 2025 in any of these corridors? So there were 4 that we did not feel were ready to advance at this time, given other factors, primarily the Blue Line extension, which affects both the West Broadway Cedar corridor and a potential Lowry Avenue corridor. We opted not to proceed with Nicollet Avenue, given the City of Minneapolis's locally preferred alternative for modern streetcar between downtown and Lake Street. And then the Randolph Avenue and East 7th line, again, choosing not to advance that at this time until more is known about how that Riverview Modern Streetcar project, which folks may or may not be familiar with, changes the travel conditions and the street along West 7th Street in St. Paul. So with those two factors, we kind of put everything together and filtered from the top to the bottom on this chart here. I won't spend a lot of time on this one. It's a lot of information that I think is probably better shown in this slide. But this is where we're at right now in terms of prioritizing the next lines. We've got 4 corridors that we've identified as potential near-term candidates. And so those are Central Avenue going from downtown up to the Northtown Mall, Como, Maryland, traveling from downtown Minneapolis to the east side of St. Paul via Como and Maryland Avenues. The Johnson-Lyndale corridor, which would travel from New Brighton down through Minneapolis, and then all the way down to Richfield and Bloomington. And then the Rice Street, Robert Street line, which would travel between Little Canada, downtown St. Paul, and Mendota Heights. So from those 4 right now, we're really seeking a lot of public engagement and feedback to help us identify what ultimately should be the F, G, and H lines. And so I will ask this of this audience, I have of many folks recently, but we're looking for help in getting the word out. So we've got a website with an online survey and a lot of information there. I'd encourage you to share this with your networks and participate in our survey yourself. We're also doing a lot of work to get the word out. And ultimately, as I mentioned, are going to be taking a recommendation in the spring for what the F, G, and H lines should be, as well as taking an action to the Transportation Advisory Board to fund the F line in a large part in spring of next year. So the work continues though. We'll keep looking at local and express bus visions in next year for 2040, and plan to update this plan in about 5 years to help identify our next priorities. So with that, that reaches the end of my slides today. And I would love to answer any questions that you all might have. Thank you again for the opportunity. I really appreciate the invitation and spending time with you today.
Well, thank you very much, Katie. We already have 2 questions in the chat, so I guess we'll start with those. But if people have questions, if you can raise your hand and then we can call on you to unmute you, or pose your question in the chat so she can answer it directly. So I don't know if you can see these or if you want me to read them out. But there's a question from Bailey Waters. Will the lower speed limit of 20 miles per hour impact the speed of buses at all, or is it more impacted by station location frequency?
Great question, Bailey. A couple of things here. The first being that as the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul lowered their speed limits, certainly we worked with them to identify how that would affect our bus routes and our operations across both of those cities. I would say that if we think back to that, I know I shared a lot of information, but that chart of the beeline speeds, I think there are maybe only a couple times each day where bus speeds are actually above 20 miles an hour. I think on the whole, on average, we're operating at a lower speed just because of those stops. So removing a lot of those stops really does a lot to improve the speed of buses. But I will say that on the whole, we're not expecting to really be above the posted speed limit too much of the time in a lot of these corridors. I see Lindsay's question here too. Hi, Lindsay. It's good to see you. Good to see your name at least. So your question is on the beeline. Can you describe what makes the current westbound trip time shorter than the eastbound trip time at all times of day? Huh, interesting question. Let's see here. I will have to dig into my brain a little bit to think about that one. It may have to do with a couple of sort of routing issues along the corridor. So we currently travel along Lake Street for most of the line, but turn into the Chicago Lake Transit Center. And so there is a difference in our speed doing so in each of those directions with the various turns onto and off of Lake Street. That's one piece. Another has to do with the routing at the end of the line in Uptown, where the route essentially makes a one-way loop to the terminal. So that may have something to do with it as well. But beyond that, honestly, I don't know the answer to your question right now, and would just say that there are a lot of factors that are affecting the speed of traffic in that corridor, and we're digging that into that right now. And I see Nick nodding too. We've got Alliant working with us on that project as well. So I've got a maybe question here from Alan. Maybe less of a question, more of a comment. I'm not sure if there's anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, somehow I didn't get the second sentence of my comment, and that was, how much is the operating cost and what is the source of funds for the subsidy?
Sure. So in terms of, I think your comment here is about the capital costs, and yes, that our projects are capital funded with a mix of federal, Met Council, and state bonds. Typically is how we've funded the capital costs. On the operating side, these routes are part of the overall Metro Transit operating budget. And so it's funded by the sources that fund the rest of our bus operations. And that's just, it's folded into our overall budget. All right, I see a question here from Steve. What is your sense of the professional labor force involved in developing these options? I realize it's a lot of consultants, but perhaps you could estimate a number of people involved. So Steve, I guess, are you thinking more about the total number of folks? Is that what your question's getting at?
Yes, total number, engineering, and others.
Sure. That's a little bit tough to answer. I think, certainly as we've engaged with firms to support us in the design and delivery of these projects, how they structure their teams and how they structure their team's allocation to each of these projects varies pretty significantly. I will say that we've got a pretty small crew of Metro Transit staff who are really at the core of doing this. But again, we're engaging a lot of folks from across Metro Transit as we get closer to operations as well. So I'm not sure that I can really answer that in terms of a number of people involved.
Do we have other questions?
Yeah, Al Forsberg, I don't seem to have figured out your chat feature here.
No
If I can
problem.
ask you directly. I know on the light rail system, crime and vandalism has been a problem. Are you experiencing that with the BRTs and doing anything special with design to mitigate that?
Sure. So I think you're perhaps speaking to some things that have been in the news about just in terms of personal safety and things of that nature on the light rail system. Certainly, as we're thinking toward the BRT system, we're thinking about both active and passive ways to make those secure environments. And first, I'll just note that I think there's not a universal experience for our customers as they're experiencing the line, but we do want to think about how we can make these safe environments for our customers and our operators. And so on the station side, thinking a lot about how can we create environments where folks can see and be seen, both in terms of transparent views into and out of shelters, in terms of in terms of systems that record the area in our security cameras, an active line to the Transit Control Center and the Metro Transit Police Department through those emergency telephones. And also, I think a big part of making people feel safe and secure is providing a good sense of how long you're going to be waiting at that area. And so the real-time information that we provide on screens gives people the knowledge of when their bus is coming and helps them feel more secure in that trip making. Excuse me, on the bus itself, certainly we also have cameras monitoring those environments on the vehicle, as well as a series of Metro Transit police officers that check for fares on board and are also just part of being on that bus to provide a security sense as well. So, it's a lot of the same strategies that we see on the light rail side that we're thinking of adapting and delivering in that bus side as well to ultimately make folks feel safe and secure while they're riding with us. Excuse me.
It looks like there's a question from Sean. Are electric buses planned for all arterial BRT?
So we did deploy electric buses on the C line that opened in 2019. Those buses have on route chargers up at the Brooklyn Center Transit Center at the end of the line. So they both charge in the garage overnight and then charge at the end of each trip to kind of continue to provide battery capacity. I think what we've seen is some challenges with how that technology has rolled out, and certainly in terms of the range of the electric buses that are on the market right now. They are not able to travel as far as the buses that we have in our fleet. And so how we fit those in has been a little bit of a challenge. So at this point, as we're advancing the D-line project, as we're advancing the B-line and the E-line, we're really hopeful that the market continues to improve in terms of the electric bus options that are on the market. But at this point, we do not have firm plans that electric buses would be part of those deployments.
Yes, I have a question if you're, so how much does future kind of development of the community, so how much are you looking at where populations might move, factor into your planning of some of these long-term visions?
Sure, good question. So I mentioned as we look to plan out those future lines, we're looking at both existing populations and jobs, as well as future growth, and thinking about that in a couple of dimensions in terms of what are the forecasts for population, what are the forecasts for jobs in each of these areas, but also what are the local land use plans and how supportive are they of transit. We see a lot of connection between the certainly land uses and that side of policy with how successful transit can be in certain areas. And so I will say that as we're thinking about the next few lines of BRT, there are still a lot of places in highly developed areas where there's a lot of need and a lot of demand for improved transit. And so as we're thinking more about those maybe more growing or emerging or outlying areas, I also point to the importance of thinking about kind of the spectrum of transit improvements. And so places where we can start thinking about improving the frequency of regular route service, making it easier to walk to the bus stop, doing things of that nature so that it can be considered for future BRT down the line as demand grows. Excuse me. So sort of a thinking of it along that spectrum, but certainly with an eye toward both the existing and the plans for population and jobs and walkability and transit supportiveness.
I had a question if you have a second. So I think you touched on this a little bit, basically the COVID impacts, big picture, and what assumptions are you making going forward, and are those evolving constantly? Are you saying, you know, this is what we're going to look at going forward, making certain assumptions, or is it sort of like our companies that are, you know, changing week to week, you know, depending on governor's orders and other things? Can you talk a little bit big picture about COVID impacts?
Sure, great question. Great question, and something that I think, you know, when you talk about, can you make assumptions from day to day? I think in large part the answer is no. You know, I think we all see that things are continuing to change a lot, but in terms of thinking about sort of the next arterial BRT investments we have queued up, I think continuing to see the role that transit plays in these corridors where folks are still relying on transit quite a bit to get around, where essential trips are being made every day still, and demand is still there. That's really where we see that focus of improving the transit service with these BRT investments being really well targeted at both the markets that's there and the market that we want to continue to support as we think about the future of transit investment. And so while a lot remains unknown, and I think we've had the ability on some of our future looking plans to say, okay, we're going to hold back, we also know that we need to keep planning for these projects to get them into the pipeline. And the ones that we're including in our plans right now are the places where that demand has been relatively stable and we think will continue to be. So kind of a mix of knowns and unknowns, but in terms of the investments that I've shared about today, those are the places where we really see that core transit demand continuing.
Thank you. Good presentation.
So I think we have a couple minutes if there's some last questions, but I know people might have things at once, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Well, I really want to thank you for being here to present with us today. And then also just remind everyone who's on the call that we'll be sending out PDH certificates just for your own records. And then also just to announce January should be a pretty busy month. So we should have both a member appreciation event and a normal section meeting. So I hope you can join us for that. And yeah, thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you. And thank you again. It was so great to have this conversation with you all, and I really appreciate the invitation. So thank you.
Yes, thank you, Katie. Awesome presentation today.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good holiday season.